I came here when I was 5 years old. One of the first people I remembered seeing around the place was Ned here. And he often used to drive my father and mother to funerals and things like that. And this is the first school that I came to. I was 6 when I started here. I was living in the area for a year and then I started school here. Lots of people put them up, Ned, didn't they? They'd have a bush and they'd put colourful things on it, little bows, and some people used to get the children to colour the eggshells, when the eggs would be eaten, and to be kept for the May. You'd store them away when it would come near the 1st of May, along April, as people would eat a boiled egg. It would be left to one side, and sometimes the children would paint it, other times it would be just left in its own form. And then the children of the house or the area might go and put it in over the branches and, that way, break a little hole in the egg. And then they'd put bows and it'd be put up maybe in a prominent place, and then would it be up on a pier or
on a pier or a wall?
Yeah. Any place of height where it could be seen. And sometimes it would be done maybe down the road near other people's houses or whatever, and it would be on a bush that had be already grown. Other times they'd cut the bush and bring it and tie it up in a place that it would be seen around the farmyard or whatever.
Generally stuck down in a heap of dung.
Yeah, often put it on the dung heap in the yard.
There's a Father O'Brien, he used to come from New Ross, and he'd blessed salt, and then he'd blessed this water, and you went around to each corner of the field with it, and spilled a drop of the water and made the side of the cross, and it was just to do with the strands.
And also, I think they used to bless two jugs of water.
Yeah.
And one was for animals. They put them on, the farm animals and things like that. Anything got sick, or different times of the year if they were moving them from one area of the farm to the other. They might, maybe weaning the calves or lambs away from the others, and they'd bless them with the particular water that the priest would be after calling around to bless.
Trans were so bad that they ate a field of corn. The trans were, when the field of corn
bad
would be up.
infestation and would destroy the corn. You'd see the patches in the fields where it'd go all kind of yellow and die off then.
Yeah. When it comes to 11 o'clock or that, the door would be opened and they'd put something away that I couldn't shut. But then they'd kneel down and say the rosary, and that was the end of the year.
I just remember my parents putting the candle in the window like that on an All Souls night.
Yeah, and they opened the candle that, and leaving the door open. Remember that?
I don't remember that.
12 o'clock the door would be opened. Some put to keep the door from closing until the new year was in.
No, there wouldn't be any Christmas trees. The first things that I remember was little decorations to be put across the house, and the paper. There were little paper ones, and you could fold them up. You remember those, Ned? And then they were all different colours, and you just open them out like an accordion, like that, and you'd just pin them to each corner, and they usually put them around from one corner to the other. Yeah. And some of them would open up in the form of a little bell, that when you see it folded down, it was just half a bell, and then you just brought it around, and if it was a full bell, you just clicked it in a little, I don't know, it was pinned in, and then you hung it in the centre between where the other little, they're kind of paper, not much stronger than tissue paper, that kind of little crepe paper or something. and it'd be very colourful stuff, and then of course the usual holly that people brought in from with berries. Everybody wanted holly with berries on it. It looked a little bit more brighter and cheery and so on. And of course, sometimes the birds would be after taking the berries off of it, and sometimes local people would be after getting before you and getting the best of it, and you'd have to do it just plain holly. And the Christmas trees came more popular when we had electricity, because before that, 1957, was the rural electrification scheme came to this area here. It was around the county, maybe, it took a few years. So in 1957 it came to Galbally, and then when the Christmas trees became popular, the Christmas lights came as part of that, and they were put on the tree. But before that, sure, it was just an ordinary oil lamp or tilly lamp, that type of thing, in everyone's house. And I heard of people that there was grants given for land reclamation back in the 50s and those years, and rats wouldn't have been touched because there was no heavy machinery to be able to do anything with them. And sometimes they were in the middle of a field, or maybe on a ditch between two fields, that the fields would have been made more recently than the rats went back hundreds of years. There's one on our farm, and it's between two fields. And if you were doing, we'll say, drainage or land reclamation of any sort in the area, you wouldn't be encouraged to touch the rat. They really didn't say don't, but you get no money. We just say there was so much of a grant for doing the rest of the work. Well, whatever, if you decided to touch the rat, you wouldn't get any money, any grant for touching that, and you'd be advised not to touch it. But local people had it more from a point of view superstitious things, but I think it was for historical reasons that the departments, the government wouldn't like it touching the rat because of their historic value. But the local people, I heard of a man that did go ahead and level out the rat or whatever. And then sometime after, he had a problem with his eye. I think something happened to his sight in one. He lost the sight of one eye. And of course the story as it went on said that it happened when he was actually doing the rat, and so on. Now I knew the man, but I never asked him what happened to his eye. But local people said, oh, that's because he leveled out a rat.
The only thing I ever heard was a man, that time you had to get the fern for the fire, and he went in and he cut down the 2 or 3 trees in a rat, and he was no length till he got these darts in his hands. He lost the use of one of his hands. But I said it was from cutting the trees down which belonged to the fairies.
The two main, if you go back further than the name of Galbally, the two main areas around here was Dunoney and Barmoney, and they were formed around old convents and what would you call it, kind of I don't know whether it was nuns or monks or who lived in them, but there's the stones are in the field down there in Barmoney. You've seen those. Well, that was where there was a little community of nuns or whatever, and Dunoney had the same over in Fortunes of Dunoney, and there on, if you looked at an old map, they were two very important areas at that time. And the old village of Galbally started, it's not where we know it now. It was up, I'd say, is there Kyo children here, Patrick? Kyo's? Yeah, well, where their house is and Powers, there's just 2 houses left there now, two families living there, and that's where the old village of Galbally was. And there was a lot of houses at that time, they're gone now, and they were formed around a forge, and the forge was just over one field. An Olin family had a forge, and for generations there. And the forge was very important because it was the blacksmith was the man that ran the forge, and he done all the things like shoeing the horses, and sure there was no other transport, and it was as important as the filling station of today, where you pull in your car. If you couldn't shoe your horse, you couldn't travel. And they made things like iron gates for fields out of iron, and everything the blacksmith made was out of iron. And you'd see some of the old farm gates still, and made by the blacksmiths, and they made sack trucks and other things for people to use, and they made the iron band around the wheel, you know, the big wooden wheel of a horse's cart. You'd see them in the museums and all now.
And
and they had to beat the iron and weld it together with heat. There was no electric, and make the band and put it in over the timber wheel. Is that right, Ned? And there was a forge up there that time, and another little cluster of houses, maybe 4, 5, 6 families. But their church was in Barmony, and there's evidence in a field of ours. There's a little, what we call a stile, steps, you know, where you get in over the ditch, and then there'd be stones making the ditch, building it, and then there'd be 2 or 3 stones sticking out, flat flags, where you put your feet to step down at the other side. You go up one side of the ditch, down the other, and then you walked along. And there'd be stepping stones in the river, the Spring River down here, and up to Barmony, that they didn't come up this way at all. So you had the crossroads in the village here, and there was no houses, nothing. Everything was up that lane, but it was still in Galbally, because the townland of Galbally, it was more central. The townland of Galbally is bigger than the village. We have several little townlands around here, like we'll say Rahinahoon, where Ned was born. You have Tom Farney, Corknaboola, Fenlon, there in Barmony, and then you have Galbally as a townland, but it has the village where the other townlands don't. And there's people living in each townland, and they come here to the community of Galbally. So for years then, the people went to mass in Barmony, and we can see where this mass path, and it would be even done on maps and things. It was very important. Everybody had the right to do it, and you couldn't. Landowners couldn't stop the other locals from using the mass path. So when that ended, the old church and all down in Barmony, then for so many hundred years, as we all know, it was illegal to go to mass, so there was no churches, and people had mass wherever they could. And then after that period in time, about 200 years ago, our church up here is nearly 200 years old now, and we celebrated the 175th anniversary probably 10 or 15 years ago, and the new village was formed around the church, and the landlord that owned all the land around here and was renting it out to tenant farmers, he gave land for the priest's field, for the priest's horse, and to feed his animals, and because he had to live out like the rest of us that way. And then there was a new school built where the school was built where the car park and grotto is now. And then there was the priest's house, and eventually the old school went into bad repair, and the new school here was built then, still in the village. So the reason, I suppose the reason that they moved the village, because of the crossroads. You had the 4 roads leading into it, and it was a nice place. And where Ned lived, then the same landlord, he owned that house. He was from New Ross, and that house, it was the Talbot family, wasn't it? and it was a pub for a while.
Yeah.
The Busher family owned it,
Yeah.
and they had a pub there, and then it was closed, and some years and years ago.
Just handed in the license because they got too old
Yeah,
to serve, you see.
yeah.
And they were gone, there were two old ladies and an old man.
Is that right, Ned?
And then there was another brother, and he was in the mission house in Enniscorthy.
Yes.
And when Father Cullen started the Pioneers Association, he was there.
He was.
And he come out and he got the sisters to close the pub.
Yeah.
So the license was just handed back.
So Father Busher was in the same community in Enniscorthy as Father Cullen that started the Pioneers, isn't that right?
Yeah.
And then he would have been embarrassed trying to get a new movement going of anti-drink and all. So he just come home and it was acceptable that he'd come home and say, listen, close the pub, it doesn't look well. Changed the mass path. The mass path then was there were still people living in the old village when the new one started up. So there was a mass path down across the fields there, and the style out on the road and all.
On the road, on the clearances.
Yeah, and it cut off if you were to come by road, like the Kyo children have to come down by road now down to the main road from where they're living, and up here, the mass path you went cut off the angle that way, and it was a lot shorter because people were walking. There's a lane down here, and it's known. It's joining the two roads, the Barmony Road and the Adamstown Road, and it's called Andy's Lane. And nobody ever remembered Andy or any.
Nobody remembered him, but Hayden told me once that there was stones there down just behind your wood.
Yeah.
Andy lived there, and it was the priest here got Andy to do the road, to build that lane.
You know, maybe that's it then.
Yeah.
Another thing that I heard, I remember your mother well.
Yeah.
And she talked about the milestones that were around on the road. Now, I never saw a milestone. I'm sure they're around in the county. But there was one on the corner of Andy's Lane, she told me. Yeah. And there was another one near you, where you lived up in Rhino.
Up in the window. And there's one at the Talbot House.
Is that right?
Yes. It was in the window stool.
And I think they were Old English miles, longer than or Old Irish miles. Is that
Old Irish.
Yeah, that there were, and acres were like that. Some people, when I was a boy, some people would say to you, the older people would say there's 5 acres in that field. And somebody else would tell you there's 8 acres there.
Yeah.
And the difference was the older person would be going by the Old Irish acres.
Yeah.
And it was a bigger area than the statute acres, as we call the English ones. And the miles were the same, and the old milestones are further than the mile, really. They're Irish miles. And they're just a stone. Yeah. And I suppose it was just a mile from between each one of them around the corner.
It was a crow's foot that was cut.
Is that right? Yeah. I never saw one.
You never saw one?
No.
Yeah, well, there's one in Talbot House now, but they covered it up there, they painted the stone, which was terrible. It was granite.
Yes.
Window stewards.
Yeah.
And it was cut into the granite.
Yes.
And now it's painted the granite.
All right. So it's not as visible now.
Well, I say if you went to, I'd know where it is, like if you went, you could clean it, you know. You know, they went in a tunnel. There was a tunnel ran from Dakins of Clonmore down to Brennan graveyard, where the church was. So they went in the tunnel, but not so long ago, a few years back, this man started, and he opened the tunnel a good bit of it, but he went about 2 fields of it, which it was too far for him to go the whole way,
Yeah.
you know. And he ran into trouble with the people that hoarded the land as well,
Yeah.
you see. Yeah.
So Ned, what you heard was that there was a tunnel that brought people to Brennan graveyard, was that right?
Yeah, to go to Mass.
Because
Yeah.
the new village of Galbally was moved from the centre of the townland to the crossroads. But the crossroads, a lot of townlands were divided by either a stream or a small river or the road. So Coolafalon comes up along into the village here, and Ned is living in Coolafalon officially. Anything on the right hand side of the road over there, and the old school and yard, anything on that side, this side of the road is Coolafalon until you go down here to the bridge, the spring bridge as we know it, and the stream, then you're into Barmony. And on the other side of the road there is in Galbally, so technically the shop there and the priest's house and the church and all, they're in Galbally, and this is Coolafalon. And Bree, the other village in the parish, is the same way.
Yeah.
Across the road is Knocknagross, and the school is in Knocknagross, the new hall is in Knocknagross, the new graveyard, everything on there, and there's a good few houses. And then on the left you have the shop and the church and old graveyard around the church, and more houses up along, and they're in Bree, but the village is called Bree. But we'll say the police or anything like that, they would be on their map, it would be Knocknagross.
Yeah.
I'd say Ned would remember Galbally. I always heard the stories about how lovely the village of Galbally used to be with trees. There were, you see, it was big trees, mature trees, and it had never been touched. And then it was fields and all made around it. And some of the memories that people had was the way in the summertime when the leaves would be out, that the trees met nearly across the village. Is that true?
Right across the road.
Yeah, because the road went out. The road went out further. You know the way the cross was a very big wide area now. Well, that's when the trees were all taken out of it.
Yeah.
But before that, the road had to go around the trees, and the trees were able to cross the road and meet one another. Actually, there's a lane down just beyond where Ned is living there, and where the old ball alley used to be. A little lane goes down along. Yeah. There was families lived on it, and down at the very end, the Freeman family lived down there. And
Sullivan.
That's right. Yeah. And was there Laffins or was there something?
Laffins owned the land down there.
Yeah.
But Dillon's
but it's known as the Wood Lane. And the last of the wood is still down there on a brow, on a very steep brow, and the rest of it was all changed into farmland. Was it did the Hughes family that came from the north of Ireland to teach here? Did they take trees and make fields down there?
It was all wood.
Yeah.
You see the land there right under us.
Yeah.
And it was, but this master teacher. He was, and he invented this thing that by winding this, he'd bring the tree out the roads.
Yeah.
And he'd done the whole, there's about...
He made fields out of whole wood down there, and he was teaching here in the old school in Galbally himself and his wife. They were both teachers, and they came from somewhere in Northern Ireland. Because at that time, there was no north or south, it was just all Ireland under British rule. So the teachers could come from anywhere. You know. Well, it was just over the road there by your house, Ned, over the Keerick Road, as we call it, because that was another, I forgot to leave that and to mention that townland here in our area, Keerick, it's just down that road. And At the Y, there was a little Y where this wood lane is. We called that the wood lane ever since.
Yeah.
And at the Y of the wood lane, there was a kind of an area there that there was nothing in. It wasn't being used for any farming purposes. There was nobody living on it. The space was there. And would it be around the 30s that it was built? I used to hear Patsy Grady talking about it.
Yeah, I'd say it was the 30s.
Yeah,
And built a few of the boys around started.
yeah.
So
Built voluntary work, you know, just.
they had the connection.
Yeah,
You wouldn't get all that time in.
yeah.
Because they went around anyhow to collect what cement what they could buy. So they built so now it was there, and the next thing, the children were getting up on the wall, and the big high wall
Became dangerous.
It was highly dangerous.
But there was no roof on it. It was never roofed.
No.
And or none of the ball alleys around the county were roofed at that time. The first one I ever heard of with a roof on it, and it was the top of the place, was down in Timon. They put a roof. They were big into handball down there. But the one over here was just 4 walls made by wooden cases, you know, wooden frames, and you filled the cement and stones in between it. And there was a ditch built in at the back that you could stand up and look at the rest of the lads playing. To be only the wall would be inside would be maybe 6, 7, 8 foot high, but when you got up on the ditch, you just looked in over the wall and you could see the other fellas playing. And then if you wanted to play, well, you got down off the ditch. Then it was your turn, and people enjoyed it over there for a long time. A lot of the time they were looking with no roof on it or anything. The ball would be outside of the alley as often as it would be.
Only the one thing which was dangerous.
Yeah.
And the council come along and they said it should be knocked. So they knocked the ball alley.
And the ball would be lost an awful lot. Young lads would go over and lose the ball. And Toddy Dillon lived near it, and Toddy would be out around in the evenings after work, and he'd be going around, and he had an interest. He was up in years at that time, but when he was young he liked handball. So Toddy would find the ball, and he had a little shed that he kept tools and you know, little hedge clippers and sprongs and things in, and he'd hide the ball. It was thatched, the little shed, and he'd just put the ball up in the thatched roof. And then young lads would come and no, any handball this evening, lads, he'd say, we've no ball, they'd say to him. And they'd know Toddy'd have one.
Supply him with.
You see, because he always did. And they'd say all sad looking, you know, oh sure, no ball. Well sure, maybe we'll do something about it. And sometimes he'd joke and say, oh God, that's a pity, and walk off. And then we'd think he had no ball. So then he'd turn around and throw it in, and we were right again. I often remember my mother telling a story that herself and her sister was coming from Enniscorthy home one night late, and at some part of the road between their home and Enniscorthy, a dog came along. It was kind of they had no lights on the bike or anything, but it was a kind of a moonlight, or you know, a little bit, and you'd see where you'd be going. And they noticed the presence of this dog running along, so they didn't mind for a while. And then they were wondering at the hour of the night, and the dog kept coming and coming. And finally, he turned down a side road. And the story was that there was somebody killed right where the dog turned down on that road, maybe accidentally, or I don't know. But you would hear of things like that. Yeah, I was just saying to Ned there, both of us were remembered as youngsters. We'd go down to the Spring Bridge, the Spring River down there, and we'd be trying to fish and dam the river and sort of catch trout or whatever. But we used to hear this sound over in the field a little bit, so we went over anyway, and there was a big iron, like a door, down flat on the ground, and a stone building, square stones, a square built in stones, and down under this thing we just see at the side of the iron door cover lid thing, you just peep down in the dark, And we used to put our ear down to hear this thing, and you'd hear a little shunting sound little thump every now and again. So we made inquiries, and it was a very, very advanced piece of technology at that time, maybe over 100 years ago, 120 years ago. They called it a ram, didn't they?
Yeah, ram.
Yeah, and it was the interesting thing about it was it was driven with its own power. There was no electric, no oil, nothing like that. There was a spring for the water, and the water flowed in from the spring. It was piped into it, and it fell down on this ram, and the ram turned, a wheel turned with the I think it was the power of the water. I'm not so sure, but it needed no fuel or anything like that. It just kept thumping away, and the pipes were brought up through the fields over 100 years ago to the new village that I had been telling you about, to this village here, and it's piped into the vestry of the chapel. It's piped into the priest's house and the old school. And then when this new school was built in 1950, the same thing was in existence. And do you notice the big square cement building just across the road there? Well, that's the tank, and there's a ladder up to it, and it used to fill this with water, and the water then had come from there into the houses, into the school here, and so on. And all from the ram pipe up through the fields. And the pipes are still underground now, but they're not being used. But they're used up to probably 20, 25 years ago. I'm not so sure when it stopped being used, but I do know that it kept going long after electricity coming to the village.
Oh, it did.
They still didn't change over immediately. People sunk their own wells then and with electric pumps and that type of thing. But that serviced the village for over 100 years with water.
Well, it was a very long building and went straight across from the ground out here. And it was, in the centre there was a chimney. And that chimney served the two, because the teachers only had a fire. Of course, the pupils no eating. The teachers had had the fire, and then we have to go out and pick up the sticks, because there was big beech trees that was going across. There'd be some bad, rotten pieces that fall down. We'd have to gather up them and bring them into the school to keep the fire going. But there was 3 teachers here at the time. There was a master man and Mrs. Murphy and Miss Lawler. So after a while, Miss Lawler went, and there was only 2 teachers, and I had to do the 2 schools. So maybe a half time you'd be with one teacher, and then you'd be moved at 12 into another school, and the one at another school would come back out to where you would live. So it was very cold, and there was big bay windows, half the wall of a big bay window, and both ends. And the glass was broken when you'd freeze in it. It was terrible, you know.
Yeah.
Well, the old school was where the grotto and car park is now,
Yeah.
and it was out in the middle of the car park, out that way. And it was there, and for years, I suppose, built when the church was built, I'd imagine, and it got into bad repair, and the new one was built in 1950. So obviously the old one then must have been used up to 1949, and it was left there then for, I'd say, 20 years or more. I would have remembered it, and just getting looking bad then. But we used to hold concerts in the where the school was in the actual building, and eventually it got into very bad repair, and then the little concerts and things that had been held in seasonal Lent and times like that, it was moved to a shed that the priest used to use years before that for hay for his horse, but then that was moved on, cars were in, and his shed wasn't being used, so they revamped the shed and made it as comfortable as possible for things. And then in 1988 our new community centre was built. But the old school served those two purposes while it was there, and it was a kind of dangerous and an eyesore in the village, and they levelled it out, and it was left as a car park for a good while then, just a car park. And then about 20 years ago, the new grotto, in 1991, the new grotto was built then, and it's a little focal point in the car park now, and it's very nice there.
Yeah.